And so I am excited to introduce our first speaker for the day. We have Yuhei Nakayama here. Yuhei is actually a PhD student in the Department of Crop Sciences at University of Illinois with Andrew. And so those soybean yields have continued to increase over recent decades. Illinois' recommendations on phosphorus management for soybeans are outdated, with fertilizer often applied only at the start of the 2-year corn-soybean rotation. Updating recommendations on the 4 R's of phosphorus fertilization for soybean will help expand farmers' toolboxes to maintain yield while minimizing environmental impacts. So Yuhei is going to give a great presentation this morning, so please help me welcome Yuhei to the podium.
Okay, hi everyone. Can you hear me okay? As introduced, I'm Yuhei Nakayama. I'm a third-year PhD student at the U of I, and I'm a student from Japan. And today I'll be talking about the project I've been working for the past 2 years, titled as Comprehensive Evaluation of PBS Management Practices for Soybean to Increase Nutrient Use Efficiency, Profitability, and Water Quality. So before I dive into the main topic of my talk, because I'm from Japan, and you may be wondering why a Japanese student is studying soybean in the middle of Illinois. And so I looked into some history of soybean in Illinois, and I actually found out the first soybean that was ever planted in Illinois was introduced by a Japanese. So there may be, it's a coincidence, but there may be a reason why I'm studying soybean here. I ended up in U of I. And this is a little personal, but I do care about soybean because the soybean used for a lot of great food product in Japan, and Japan imports quite a bit of soybean. So this project does matter to me as well. So now let's talk about why we as a state of Illinois have to care about soybean production system, and especially the P management aspect. So as we know that the Illinois soybean production contributes to 13% of national soybean production, which is approximately 4% of global soybean production. So we produce quite a bit. And then as you can see in the figures there, it contributes to almost half of the crop acreages in the state of Illinois. And the average yield of soybean in Illinois is 45% higher than the global average yield as of 2020/2021. So with the large area being cropped as soybean and the very high yielding soybean variety that's cropped here, and also the soybean is known to have very high phosphorus concentration in the grain, there is a very high phosphorus demand in the Illinois soybean production system. But as many of you know, that the Illinois Agronomy Handbook, which gives the recommendations on how we should be managing these P, are probably outdated, and the soybean is usually treated as a residual feeder, which means in the corn-soy annual rotation, people only fertilize the corn phase, and whatever is left over after the corn phase is used to feed the soybean. So soybean deserves more respect in terms of fertilization. And there's also an issue of P fertilizer price going up recently. So there's a need for expanding toolbox for farmers to better manage the phosphorus in the fields. So when we talk about the nutrient management in agronomy, we usually use the framework of 4 R's, the right source, rate, timing, and the placement. And my study focuses more on the source aspect of it. So the P fertilizer sources in Illinois are mainly the ammonium phosphates, as you know, specifically the MAP and DAP. And although the MAP and DAP are used as a P fertilizer, they contain extra nitrogen as ammonium, the 11 and 18% respectively. But soybean can biologically fix almost half of its own nitrogen demand, and with the rest of nitrogen demand can come from soils. So the nitrogen fertilization is often become unnecessary in the soybean production. So this may be an overlooked source of nitrogen loss through leaching if those extra nitrogen from the fertilizer are not used by the soybean. And the alternative fertilizer option is the TSP, or it's nitrogen-free superphosphate. It doesn't contain any nitrogen. And this was once dominant in Illinois as a fertilizer source, but and it got recently reintroduced to the U.S. market. So the use of nitrogen-free triple superphosphates may be able to mitigate the potential nitrogen loss, and also may lower the cost. Of course, this varies by suppliers. I know it's not as common in Illinois now, but when I looked at the price in the World Bank, the TSP was placed a little bit cheaper than the DAP in terms of price per metric ton. So the question here is, what would happen if we substitute the DAP and MAP with TSP? And then how does that interact with the rate, timing, and the placement? And also soybean is known to have very nitrogen-rich residues, so when those mineralize and break down into fields, they will contribute to some nitrogen leaching as well. So we wonder what the magnitude of that looks like. So to answer these questions, I set up field trials at 2 sites, one in Urbana, also this is on campus of U of I, and then another one is at Ewing. Under is the soil types of alpha-salts. I conducted 2 years of soybean study there. And the design was the randomized complete block design with P fertilization treatments with 3 different sources that I mentioned, MAP, DEP, and TSP. And there are 2 rates, the maintenance rates and 75% of the maintenance rate. And this rate was determined based on the soil test that I conducted. And I found that those field sites were under the maintenance range. And then I also, at the same time, evaluate 3 timing replacement combinations, the fall broadcast, spring broadcast, and the spring banding. And then if you're curious about the actual numbers of the rates I apply, these are the numbers and tables. So with that, I had 18 treatments plus 1 on fertilizer control. So with the 5 replicates, there was 95 plots total per site that I worked on. And I measured the grain yield and the phosphorus removal by grain harvest and the phosphorus use efficiency. And at the same time, I evaluate the off and the in-season nitrate reaching using the lysimeters. And here's a brief timeline that I have. But as you can see, in the fall 2020, we started the trials, and then we installed a small set of the lysimeters to the fall P applied plots, and then these lysimeters were harvested in spring 2021. And I call the leaching that is measured within this time frame with the lysimeters off-season reaching because there is no crop growing. And then after these lysimeters are harvested in spring, we installed another set of lysimeters to all of the plots because these plots are also getting the spring P fertilization. And then these are harvested later in the fall 2021. And I call this lean season because when the crop is growing and we measure the leaching within the season. And this entire cycle was repeated once more in the second year, as you can see later in the timeline. And you may be wondering what is the lysimeter that I used, but I used a specific type of lysimeters. It's called the resin lysimeters, but it's essentially nylon bags that contain the exchangeable resin that can absorb any nutrient that passes through the resin. This is placed between a layer of quartz sands inside a PVC coupling, as you can see in the photo here. And then these are placed, installed at the 40 centimeter or 16-inch depths and below the soil surfaces, as you can see in the figures there. And so let's dive into the actual results. So I will start with the agronomy results. So how do the TSP yields compare to MAP and DAP yields? And so there are many figures. These are the yield data in the bushel per acre for 2 sites over 2 years. But basic takeaway is that I did not see any difference in the yields among the treatments over 2 years, which is a good news that we don't. The TSP will do as well as the DAP and MAP in terms of supporting the yields. And then what about the P that is removed by the soybean grain harvest? And here's the results. So that it was the same idea. We didn't see any difference in the P removal among treatments over 2 years. So this is also good news that even if you switch for TSP, you don't have to change the management aspects because they will probably remove the similar rates of phosphorus from the soils. And then the second main question is that does TSP actually reduce nitrogen leaching potential compared to the MAP and DAP? And here's the same timeline I showed. I will show the data, the time points by time points. But first one is the off-season leaching that was measured in fall 2020 until spring 2021. And what I found here, here's the box plot showing the nitrogen leaching in the unit of pound of nitrogen per acre. And as you can see here, the figure on the left, the MAP and DAP had a higher nitrogen reaching at the Urbana compared to the TSP. And at the Ewing, we observed a lower reaching in general, but we had a very high spatial variability. You can see a very broad box plots on the right side. And this was attributed to the fact that the northern half of this plot was originally corn in the previous year, and the southern half was in the soybean. As you can see in the figure, the north side is it has a corn residues, and the south side has soybean residues. And we found a very high leaching potential from the soybean, from the corn side and the northern sides. So let's get into the next time points, the in-season leaching from spring 2021 to fall 2021. So there's a lot of data points because all of the plots were evaluated because they include the spring fertilization treatments. But what we essentially found was there was no significant treatment effects. So these evaluated sources rates and timing didn't influence how much the nitrate was lost from the fields. We found it generally comparable or higher leaching in this in-season leaching compared to the off-season leaching that was measured in the same year. And then this is the off-season leaching of the second year of the trials. And what we found is that surprisingly we didn't see any treatment effects except the rate for Ewing. But this was confusing because the lower rates of replication actually led to higher nitrate leaching. So I'll have to look into why that happened. But we found a very high leaching from mollusol sites. So here's a panel showing the data from the previous year, and you can see that the leaching amount more than doubled. It went up to 400 pounds of nitrogen per acre compared to in the previous year it was about 150 to 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And we attributed this potentially to the breakdown of soybean residues, because in the first year it was after corn, but the second year this was after soybean. So these nitrogen-rich soybean could be breaking down, and they're leading to higher nitrate losses overall. And then we found very low leaching at the offisols. If you look at the scales, it only goes up to 10 pounds of nitrogen per acre. But this could be one reason that maybe the offisols and the Ewing site has very low organic matter compared to the mollusols. Also, if you look at the photo here, this is the field before we harvested the soybean. That there's a native grasses that just start growing, and it's like a norm for them not to like disturb these grasses. They just naturally grow, and they'll just spray it when they plant it. So these native grasses may be taking up some nitrogen, so they may be preventing the loss of nitrogen through the leaching. So with those results, I have some key takeaways that I already mentioned. But so the yield and thus the P removal were similar across tested P sources, rates, and timing and placement at the two sites over 2 years that I tested. So for the sources, TSP was as good as MAP and DAP in terms of supporting the yield. And then for the rates, the lower rates was permissible, but after I checked the compared data to the P removal, we actually found out the maintenance rates that was used in my study may be overestimated. And this also links to the issue of updating the agronomy handbook, because these estimation of these rates are kind of tricky, and we need the more updated data to do this. And then for the timing and the placement, we didn't see the fall versus spring or broadcast or banding didn't really matter for the yield, but there's a risk for more nitrogen loss if we apply the fertilizer in the fall. And for the nitrate leaching, we found the baseline nitrate leaching, and its inherent spatial temporal variability to be very high, but we also confirmed the potential benefits for water quality from using TSP over MAP and DAP. And then we had a generally higher leaching under mollusols in Urbana. This calls for the site-specific management. The leaching is not going to be the same, depends on the sites that you work on. But we found a higher leaching after soybean, at least for the mollusol sites. So there may be a breakdown of nitrogen-rich soybean. There's a very high baseline. So that leads to a potential to target the baseline leaching, like for example with the cover cropping practice to reduce nitrogen loss from soybean production system. But they already have very high background, and fertilization doesn't matter, but their baseline may be also a good target to reduce the nitrogen loads to our river systems. So with that, I would like to thank ISA for providing the funding to let me do this project, and also my advisor, Dr. Andrew Margot, for the guidance throughout the project. And also, as you may be able to tell, there's a lot of field work involved in this one, so I would appreciate my lab members for the support. It was not possible. Working with, I worked with like 1,600 lab centers total throughout this project, so it wasn't possible without them helps. And then finally, the UIUC, the South Farm, and the Ewing demonstrations, specifically Dr. Tallenbecker and Andrew Fisher for helping me setting up the trials at these two sites.